Welcome to the Sports Trading Card Hall of Fame. Today I want to talk about a story of a hockey player by the name of Manon Rheaume. And she's a really interesting story in the history of sports cards because she is one of the few cases where one of two things. Either one, a hockey player is known by collectors universally, and two, a non-professional, an amateur player is really well known. She covers both of those stories, and the reason is because what I just said. She. If you were to look through the history of sports cards to find sports cards from a major release of cards that was a female player, a female athlete, you're going to have a tough time finding any player who was not in a part of an Olympics card set, or, well, the Sports Illustrated kids sets, which really aren't professional cards. They're not major release cards, but Sports Illustrated kids are an amazing gift to card collectors because you get cards from all over the place. Tennis, nobody was doing tennis, but they appeared there. With golf, there'd been a few card sets, but it was about the only place you were ever going to see an LPGA player, a female golfer. If you were looking around for novelty sports, they love to cover that. So you would have, I wouldn't be surprised if there was windsurfing that would show up. You would get things like X Games that would show up. It was really cool to see the broad range of sports athletes that showed up in a Sports Illustrated kids set. But that's about the only place you were going to see female athletes, again, outside of the Olympics, because, well, half of the Olympics is women's competition anyway, so it only makes sense. But the only time when there was a serious effort to make sports cards, it was always men's leagues. Not that there were very many women's leagues prior to the WNBA. It's not that the WNBA was the first. I mean, there was already a pretty significant women's basketball league when the WNBA was created, but the WNBA was at another level in terms of not so much competition, to an extent competition, but mainly with image, the way that people looked at the league and took it seriously. And so prior to that, there really wasn't women in sports outside of tennis and golf. Those were the two areas where women really did have a significant presence. So for sports card collectors, you just never saw women in sets. There would be very rare occasions where something really unusual might happen and you would see maybe a family shot. Or in 1991, Proline did their Proline wives cards for their Spirit line. Past that, where else are you going to find women showing up in sports cards? Because it's about sports, and sports are a men's realm. Traditionally, because of the nature of how a sport is constructed. It's literally constructed from the athletic capabilities of men. So that's why it was pretty fascinating that all of a sudden there was this woman who was, well, she was being considered for an NHL team. Now, it wasn't entirely taken seriously. What happened with Manon Rheaume was that she had shown a lot of promise as a hockey player, but she hadn't built a huge repertoire to really draw from. She didn't have the resume to inspire the idea that she could jump up into the NHL. But she did have a pretty impressive performance that allowed her name to start to circle in hockey. And so when the Tampa Bay Lightning was started as an expansion team, they needed to do something to inspire interest, primarily at the local level, but also a little bit more broadly. And so the idea was, well, why not bring in this female hockey player who actually has a lot of potential? Bring her in and just see how she does. And there's no reason not to do this, because bringing somebody in for tryouts, for practice, at the early stages of working through the roster, give her a chance, see how it works. The storyline was just a really wonderful storyline for women's sports, for Manon herself, very much so, but also for a franchise that Tampa Bay, did they even have an ice skating rink? Hopefully they did. But hockey in Tampa Bay, I mean, it's weird. In Jacksonville, it might make more sense. In Miami, it certainly would make more sense. But Tampa was an interesting place for a franchise. And so here they needed to build an image, and it was a great gimmick. But really, the opportunity to give a woman the opportunity to try to compete at a men's level, that was something we hadn't yet experienced. I don't think Annika Sorenstam had made her run at, well, she was pretty young at the time, but Annika Sorenstam did try to make a run at a PGA tournament, did not make the cut. Michelle Wie tried, did not make the cut. So those were just about the only times when women did try to compete in a men's league. There had been an NBA draft with a female player who did not try to pursue a career. Both Cheryl Miller and Ann Meyer did sign with NBA teams. Neither of them, though, went through the training camp and the preseason. So we've still never seen a female basketball player try to make it in the NBA. Although there has been an opportunity, the door has been opened. So Manon Rheaume was the first. And it was pretty impressive to hear and go, wait, so there is a woman. I mean, even at a minor league, even at that, it's still impressive to go, wow, really? Even today, there's conversations about a woman playing in minor league baseball. There are 3 leagues of minor league baseball. You know, why not give someone a try? But the leap for athleticism is big. And with Manon, she was in the right position for this opportunity because she was a goalie. And goalies you don't have to worry too much about physical strength. It's more about your wit and your reflexes. And so if you're good enough at that, you might have a chance at being able to hold up a little bit. And so that was it. She was in the right position to be able to take a shot at it, and she was given that shot, and she took full advantage of it. She did not take it lightly at all, but she also didn't look at it as some big quest. She was not there to prove that all women can do whatever. None of that was the case. She was a hockey player. She was given an opportunity. She showed up. And she didn't wow the world. I mean, she didn't make the cut for the team, but it was enough to inspire an entire career in minor leagues. And so she actually had a pretty good career as a goalie in minor league hockey, which was wonderful to be able to see. But it was a big part of it was it added a whole new level of interest in sports and in card collecting, because now you had this interesting little story. It wasn't too much. It wasn't being forced upon anybody. Like in racing, there's always the question about women competing in NASCAR. That's the big area where there's a lot of debate. And there had been a few racers like Shauna Robinson who had an opportunity to try to race, but it was a good old boys league. And unfortunately, Shauna Robinson's career got ended right away because some prick guy whose name happened to be Mike Wallace decided that he was going to end that and really did squash her opportunity. She wasn't given a fair place. And then there were a few opportunities through the years to see a woman try to compete in NASCAR, and it wasn't until Danica Patrick made the leap over from IRL that we finally got to see somebody actually have a viable opportunity for a career. But then there's all sorts of stuff muddled with that. And so in racing, there's long been this desire to bring women into the sport because of this expectation that they should be able to compete. And there's a need to have a new storyline that adds to the storyline that's already there. In the case of Shauna Robinson, we didn't get to see that, but in the case of Danica Patrick, we did. And that kind of a diversity of storylines in sports is really healthy. The IRL had already had that going on with Sarah Fisher before Danica Patrick got there, and it's continued on here and there with various racers. So in the world of men's sports, football's not going to see that because I think we've had kickers, female kickers in college, but they've never been able to progress. Baseball, there's still the dialogue about will there ever be a woman who will be competing for being a part of a minor league roster. In basketball, the discussion's always being had, and now we're at a point that's even more likely to see a woman maybe try to compete, but an 82 season is a long season. So I don't know if that will happen, but it's still a component to the storyline that's always really healthy. And the fact that Manon was able to maintain a career of quite a few years in the minor leagues, that really did help to diversify our experience, our journey as collectors. And it gave Classic the opportunity to make a lot of different cards of her to really keep us energized in an area of sports cards that we always overlook. Because there's an area called that Beckett calls future stars, which is players who have not yet made it into the pros, but this isn't minor league cards. This is pre-draft cards. And pre-draft is, it's a relative term. So in 1992, Classic, of course, had a card set that had Shaquille O'Neal. Well, they kept bringing him back in sets later on because he was really popular. And they would always do, every year they like to do a card set of last year's stars who made it in the pros, just to kind of add some interest and get people to continue to collect, whether it was Star Picks or Classic or Press Pass or whatever, just to be able to add a certain dynamic to make their corner of the hobby intriguing to more than just the few people who like the little novelty act. And Manon, she provided a whole new opportunity for people to pay attention to these cards and to care. And it was not uncommon for somebody to have one of her cards. I had a Manon Rheaume card. It was, I think, only one, and it was a card that I treasured in the back corner of my hobby, of my collection. It was one of those cards of, oh yeah, I've got one of her cards. And I don't remember how hard it was for me to even track the thing down, because it was one of those things in the back of my mind. It was like, yeah, it's there. But for card collectors, for a lot of us, that was an important part of our journey, was the fact that there was this one special story that really kind of intrigued us, and we were able to kind of follow along. And it was, the storyline did change a little bit, because early on it was, okay, should we take her seriously? And then it was, well, she was actually on the ice with players like Brett Hull, so she actually did, she brought it. But the fact is, she settled into a place in minor league hockey that fit, and that it fit for her, and she held her own. And that's the thing. Once you've earned your space, once you've earned your place in the overall, now you can be respected for being in the place that it fits for you. You're not being forced upon others, and she earned that. And so she started off as kind of a novelty, and then there was the transition through, is this the open door for women to suddenly flood into sports? And then it was, okay, so now we're kind of seeing how everything's balanced out. And the balanced out over the various years was, do you check in on her and see how her career is going, or are stories going to pop up about how she's going along as she's progressing as an athlete? That story I don't really remember much about, but I do know that just after her one stint, and then she settled into the minor leagues, as that was going on, this question about women in sports was not a universal one. We weren't talking about bringing women into the NBA, but it was, who's going to be the next hockey player after Manon Rheaume? And there was a kind of a burst of energy of sports cards created for women who were showing a lot of potential. The first card was for Cammi Granato. Now, Cammi Granato is the sister of Tony Granato, who was a pretty successful hockey player. So she had the pedigree, she had the name, and she was showing herself as being a pretty exceptional women's hockey player. Now, I don't know that anybody ever looked at Cammi and went, I see her trying to compete for the NHL, because, look, Manon Rheaume, goalie. Okay, all right, I can kind of see that. Cammi was a center, so that would have been quite a stretch. But it did start to increase the interest in her, and also the upcoming women's hockey team, So that was something that we started to see in card collecting. We were beginning to see these little, we were beginning to pay attention to female hockey players. And so it was a little burst of energy. It didn't last too long, but even by 1995, Rebecca Lobo appeared in the men's classic set for her prowess as a college player. This was just before the Olympics, and so the Olympic set for the women's national team, which included Cheryl Swoops in what I believe was her first non-Sports Illustrated Kids card, that was just around the corner. It had not yet happened. And so Rebecca's card was not built on the interest of the Olympics, which is where almost all female athletes had been showing up. Instead, it was looking at her as a college player, surrounded by surrounded by the men's players. And it's in that space that we were starting to see some interest that was coming from the Manon Rheaume interest, the story that had emerged from that. Now, the story of women's basketball cards is a different story, because that is the story of the 1996 Atlanta Olympics. And the women's team was the big starring feature of that Olympics. Like the 1992 Olympics had been all about the Dream Team. 1996 was all about the women's team. And the WNBA popped out of nowhere because of that. But in the lead up to that, there was a lot more conversation about women in sports. Again, not so much about women need to be a part of men's sports as much as, well, we need to take this a little bit more seriously and not completely laugh it off. And thankfully, that's exactly what happened. So eventually we did get to see more of an acceptance as we did move into women in sports with the Olympics, and then ultimately with the WNBA, which is wonderful. It's not that that was because of the Manon Rheaume story, but instead the Manon Rheaume story was its own special event that was a fascinating experience for those of us who were collecting sports cards at a pretty broad level from 1992 through about 1995. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to leave the story about Manon Rheaume with this. I'm not going to go any further into it because it's just going to get a little bit too detailed and not really all that necessary. For the sports cards, this is kind of the key to it. The fact that she did intrigue card collectors, and she had a really good run. Classic used her as a very fundamental part of their sets for quite a few years. Just like Shaquille O'Neal, who had gone pro, Manon was still in this future stars realm, and so she was a reliable piece of their story, and the one hockey player that everybody actually paid attention to, so she was very well sought after, or her cards were very well sought after. So I'm going to bring this to a close here. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, I do urge you to do so. I love covering stories about cards and the history of sports cards. That's what this channel is dedicated to. So definitely peruse around and check out the other videos that I've done if you haven't had a chance to do so. And look out for other videos. And thank you for watching.